Welcome. Today my AJM interview is with Dr. Annette Quayle from Queensland University of Technology. I'm talking with her about her co-authored paper along with Joanne Groswald from the University of Bath and Ellie Chappell from Queensland University of Technology. The paper is published in the Australian Journal of Management special issue on Grand Challenges. The title of the paper is New Modes of Managing Grand Challenges, Cross-Sector Collaboration in the Refugee Crisis of the Asia Pacific. Here is the interview. Okay, welcome Annette.
Thank you, Victoria. It is so nice to be here. Thank you. And lovely to see you again.
So what are the key insights for industry policymakers and or employees from your paper published in AJM's Grand Challenges?
Okay, so, I'd written the paper, we'd written the paper a while ago, so it was really nice to go back and have another look at it and think about, again, about what are the implications. I think sometimes we just finish our research and then we put it in a drawer and then we quickly move on to something else and forget about what it is that we've said. So actually I really liked going back and having another look at the paper. And I guess I was thinking that, there's quite a lot of the literature on collaboration, on sort of inter-organisational collaboration. And what we thought when we did the paper is that there wasn't very much that applied to, or how could you apply this to grand challenges? There just really wasn't sort of very much literature on that. So when we finished the paper, we sort of thought that there were really kind of two main areas. So it's really a governance sort of paper. It's a true management paper, actually. And one of my colleagues, Joanne Groswald, is a management scholar. She's from the University of Bath in the School of Management. And it was very helpful having a management scholar on the paper and who's also in governance. So we sort of looked at it from a governance point of view, and we sort of came up with really two kind of main areas. And so this first one is the idea of, overall it's about this idea of collaborative governance. And that's not a new idea. Like when you have collaborations, then how are you going to govern this, multi-sector organisation that you're creating? So it's kind of a classic, sort of problem that is an empirical problem, but it's also a theoretical problem. So what we sort of said is that, if we need sort of ways of managing and governing, cross-sector collaboration, and cross-sector collaboration is really at the heart of, trying to manage a grand challenge. So if you have any grand challenge, and we looked at refugees, but, I've looked at climate change, it doesn't matter what it is that the topic is, it's really you can't solve them on their own, and that's kind of the nature of a grand challenge. So we sort of argued that if you need this collaborative governance, then there's some things that really came out from the paper and from what we had a look at. And the first issue was really problems that came about because of the design, the initial design, and we call this sort of the design configuration. And so we sort of said, okay, so a lot of the problems that were being discussed by different parties to the collaboration, they were really problems that fell out or could have been solved right at the very beginning when they were setting up the collaboration. So we sort of argued that there's these sort of structural governance issues, like the structure being what does it actually look like? So at its very sort of simplest, it's around setting parameters about, what are the lines of authority, what are the lines of responsibility? So can we very clearly set up a structure where each of the different parties to the collaboration is very clear from that outset about who's responsible for what and how is that going to be authorised? How are you going to resolve tensions or issues or disagreements that come up? Because naturally that's going to happen in any collaboration. So sort of effectively it was really around the first sort of issue was around that idea of the structure, so structural governance, and we want to make sure that we at the same time, not just think about, as we often do when So I guess one of the things that we also wanted to point out when we're setting up the design is that it has to be a structure that is both formal enough, and when I'm talking about, imposing those rules and regulations and setting it out sort of clearly between the parties, but at the same time, it has to be flexible. So when you're dealing with a grand challenge, and what was really obvious to us when we had a look at, the data and the newspaper reports and the interviews and what people were saying, in those different sorts of environments, is that there's a lot of urgency around grand challenges and cross-sector collaborations for them. And so whenever parties are trying to make or come together, in times of great crisis, then, they don't have really sort of thoughtful processes that set out everything that needs to be set out at the outset. And they also have to be flexible. So not only do they have to be sort of formal, but there has to be an element where it's also going to be informal enough that it's going to allow lots of flexibility in decision making. And so what we thought was that trying to make sure that, when you have new parties that don't know each other and haven't worked together, we want to give them, both the room to make good decisions and resolve issues that come up, but at the same time do that in a way that is going to ensure the integrity of the relationships. So it's sort of, we had a look at that kind of design was sort of the first sort of suggestion we had. And then that second idea we had was around this idea which comes from management, which is sort of, really it comes from ecology, called adaptive governance. And I really liked this idea. And adaptive governance is really where you want to encourage your managers to sort of be able to kind of respond to what's going on, but and opportunities that are happening, and they kind of call that exploitation. It's part of this idea of ambidextrous management, which is very much from management scholars. And so they can exploit the opportunities, the relationships, the kind of networks that they have, but at the same time, they are able to make sure that they also can use their current knowledge and skills. So we kind of sort of see these sort of two ways that you can think about governing cross-sector collaborations for grand challenges that are, quite specific to that sort of environment or those particular problems. So they're not like just normal collaborations. They're kind of very special because they're so uncertain and for managers and urgent, and so there's so much decision making that takes place for managers in those environments. And so we kind of came at it from the point of view of trying to make sure that managers, or how can we encourage managers to be able to do that well, but at the same time do it within a set of parameters and constraints that is part and parcel of cross-sector collaboration.
So reflecting about the time when you wrote the paper and now the COVID-19 pandemic has emerged, do you think that the pandemic has accentuated or changed the messages included within your paper?
Yeah, it was really interesting to think about this because, as I said, we'd finished the paper, we put it in a drawer and we're kind of overwhelmed with other things. And then I went back last week and reread the paper. And I was really struck, as you and I are both here in Australia, and we've just had Melbourne that has been in 3 months of lockdown due to COVID. And Melbourne's not, an unusual case. There's just so many countries around the world that are in this same situation. But there's been quite a lot of discussion, commentary, analysis about how it is that Melbourne is the one state in Australia that's ended up in this particular circumstance. And so what I thought was really interesting is that for me, when I reread the paper, I just felt as though I wanted to send it to, the Melbourne politicians and health department to have a look at some of our ideas. And in fact, maybe I should sort of, it prompted me to maybe think about writing an article about it. So I think that COVID's a perfect example of a kind of grand challenge, isn't it? That, none of us saw coming. But I think that's kind of the nature of grand challenges. No one ever sees those coming. And so, but it's, the decision making is done at a time of urgency. It involves cross-sector collaboration. So we have politicians in the mix. We not just have policy people, we have not-for-profit, sort of organisations, and we have for-profit organisations. And so I think each one of those has a part to play in responding to the problems of COVID. I don't think any one of those partners has the solutions. And so what was interesting, I felt, about the Melbourne situation was that, they had quarantine, they had the decision that they would use hotel quarantine for return travellers. That's one of their biggest risks. All of this decision making is done at a time of incredible stress and urgency, and it's sort of decisions are being made overnight. No one's really tracking how they're made. And the next minute they're in this situation where they've got private security guards who aren't well trained, and COVID's then escaped into the community, and the next minute they're all locked down for 3 months, and great tragedy has unfolded individually and as a community. And I just felt that it was such a classic case of a cross-sector collaboration where, they're doing an inquiry and they're confused about who actually had authority, who made the decision. All of these things were exactly the issues that came out in our paper. And so I felt that it was actually a really nice example, sadly a nice example, of the fact that, multi-sector collaborations for sort of serious grand challenges are something that's going to continue to be an issue for communities, for trying to solve problems. And so whatever we can learn to do to improve those is going to be helpful. And I think our paper probably had a few gems for that.
So what are some future research directions suggested from your paper? And feel free to share what you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, I guess, the thing that was really nice about looking at the problems of grand challenges, and, for me as an academic, is that, it was sort of a natural kind of continuation of sort of unsolvable problems, which I'm always really interested in. And so I felt as though, we could continue to go down that pathway, and certainly the governance side of that I think is really interesting. And so what we've sort of variously done now is we're still all very interested in governance. And what's nice is that, there's, for me, so much more room outside of corporate governance research that is really interesting, and I think has real possibilities for impact. And so, we want our research to be helpful. We want our research to make a difference in people's lives. And, you wouldn't do grand challenges research if you didn't have sort of ambitions to try to make the world a better place. So I have personally been, looking at public sector governance. And my colleague Jodie Mole at QUT and I have been doing one of the, I think, endless papers that academics do now, which is a COVID paper. And so we have been looking at the state government sort of spending announcements on COVID and how that has been governed from a political point of view. And so how much transparency there's been around the announcements. I mean, every single of the major state governments has made significant billion-dollar announcements. And so how do we spend that money? How do we authorise that money? How do we ensure accountability and public value for the dollars that we're spending? So they're really important governance problems. And I think, for me, they would probably be still in that basket of a grand challenge, even though they don't necessarily fall under what we've known as grand challenges up until this moment in time.
Well, thanks for talking with me today, Annette. It's been a pleasure.